Hello, everyone. We're delighted to welcome Jennifer Wallace today to deliver the 6th annual Classics in English lecture. Very sadly, this had to be postponed last year owing to the pandemic. And so we're especially grateful to Jennifer for agreeing to return today to speak to us about her book published in 2020, Tragedy Since 9/11. Jennifer is the perfect person for this lecture series. She's Director of Studies in English at Peterhouse College, Cambridge. She has worked throughout her professional career at the intersection between classics and English. She studied both classics and English as an undergraduate in Cambridge, where she did her doctorate on Shelley and Philhellenism, published as Shelley in Greece in 1997. Her next book, Digging the Dirt, The Archaeological Imagination, 2004, ranged widely from Schlieman's Troy to Ground Zero in New York. As the convener for some years of the compulsory tragedy course in English at Cambridge, she has thought long and hard about tragedy, the subject of today's lecture. She wrote the Cambridge Introduction to Tragedy in 2007. She has edited A Cultural History of Tragedy in the Modern World, 1920 to the Present, that appeared last year with Bloomsbury. And in Tragedy Since 9/11, the subject of today's lecture, a number of her other scholarly interests converge: gender and classics, memory studies, and particularly photography and literature. Tragedy Since 9/11 is beautifully written. I think it's maybe important to remind our audience today that Jennifer Wallace is also a novelist. It's also incisive and very wide-ranging. In the introduction to Tragedy Since 9/11, Jenny makes a characteristically bold and important assertion. Literary criticism, she writes, should be reinvested with an ethical, political, moral relevance. This book, I think, shows us how this reinvestment of the ethical, the political, and the moral might be done. So over to you, Jenny, and welcome today.
Thank you. Thank you, Fiona, very much for that introduction and for this invitation. It's really good to be here virtually this year after this long year of delay. And thank you to the Oxford Archive of Classical Performance for inviting me. This is, as Fiona said, the 6th annual Classics and English lecture, and so I wanted to preface my remarks by just commenting on the triangulation of classics, English, and the post 9/11 world in my lecture. My claim is that the ancient trope of the tragic, as exemplified in classical Greek tragedy, but also in Shakespeare and the later literary, political, philosophical tradition, offers us a mode of witness. It's a generic form for making our contemporary crisis intelligible to us, or for making the unintelligibility of it intelligible. And as such, I'm not so concerned with the reception or staging of ancient tragedy in the post 9/11 world, as I am in trying to read the contemporary world through the hermeneutic lens of the tragic. I endeavor to calibrate events and the narrative of our recent history with the demands upon our critical response that traditional drama raises. And in using that word calibrate, I'm drawing upon Atto Keeson's term in his book, Calibrations. The second prefatory remark I want to make is that when I was writing Tragedy Since 9/11, I was faced with the difficulty of ever expanding material upon which to work. There seemed to be no end of tragic events. And so I had to make decisions about what to include and what not to include. You know, should I talk about Brexit? Should I talk about Trump? And so the same with this lecture, I had to make the decision, should I update my book to include COVID? I've decided in the end not to discuss the pandemic, or should we give it the traditional term plague. I'm not going to discuss it in this lecture, but I'm very happy to talk about it in the Q&A afterwards. So I have a slide presentation to accompany the talk. I'm going to share the screen now. I hope that's visible for people. In the months following the attacks on the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, DC on September the 11th, 2001, there were two parallel acts of public mourning for the dead. One form of mourning was to read the brief biographies of the many victims that appeared in the newspaper, published each day from mid-September until the 31st December in the New York Times, and soon well known collectively as the Portraits of Grief. These short 200-word profiles became a daily opportunity to remember and lament those who had so suddenly and cruelly disappeared. I read the Portraits of Grief every last word every single day, wrote Susan Sontag. I was tremendously moved. I had tears in my eyes every morning. Another Times reader commented even more explicitly on the ritualistic act of reading. Looking at the profiles each day was, he said, my act of Kaddish. The Portraits of Grief tried to give shape to the September massacre by transforming ordinary lives into significant narratives. According to New York novelist Paul Auster, one felt, looking at those pages every day, that real lives were jumping out at you. We weren't mourning an anonymous mass of people, we were mourning thousands of individuals. And the more we knew about them, the more we could wrestle with our own grief. Meanwhile, on the ground in Lower Manhattan, a second kind of mourning was taking place in the form of an excavation to retrieve the remains of the dead. For 8.5 months, workmen dug down into the ruins of the World Trade Center and sifted the debris. According to one firefighter, you look for anything that resembles human, anybody, anything. Could be clothes, could be a bone, a shoe. Progress was measured statistically. 1.6 million tons of rubble removed from the site and taken to Fresh Kills landfill site. 105,000 truckloads of material, and the remains of about 1,200 more individuals still to be identified forensically. The progress was also measured archaeologically, in the sense that the levels of dirt left to dig acquired a stratigraphic meaning. In March 2002, one firefighter expressed the desperation felt by the workmen as the debris ran out, summing up the archaeological significance of the ground, the meaning it discloses, and the emotion located in the absences. It's not over, but it's definitely winding down. You've got a great number of people that you want to find, and you've got a certain amount of dirt that's left, and there's a gap. That gap is going to be a sorrowful one, but we can't make more dirt. These two acts of mourning, retrieval and commemoration, are forms of response to a tragedy in the sense of a tragic event, and constitute tragic rituals or performances in themselves. And I'm mindful here of Raymond Williams' comment on the slide here, that it is not possible to force a division between an event and a response to an event. Both acts of mourning follow tragic plots modes and concerns, the portraits of grief like Euripides' Trojan women or Homer's Iliad, picking out individuals for lament amidst a whole city laid to waste. The truck's journey to Freshkill's landfill site with the ground zero rubble for forensic examination, recalling Hamlet's half agonized, half jocular questions besides Ophelia's grave, here's fine revolution. But the tragic mode or intervention is also located precisely in the disparity between the two, between the narrative response of the portraits and the material response of the excavation, the human bumping up against the non-human, narrative reaching its limits against the intractability of the material, question and answer, or no answer, but just further questions. These apparetics are continually confronted and challenged and displaced by individual and collective poetics. And the oscillation or dialectic between the two follows a classic tragic tradition. Since first writing an article back in 2002 on these acts of mourning following the September 11th attacks, I've been turning my attention, as Fiona said, more and more to the question of tragedy in the modern world, to the ethical obligation of the literary critic to engage in debate about war, terror, the current crisis. My book, Tragedy Since 9/11, is driven by the argument that events and history can be read as tragedies like Sophocles or Shakespeare, and that tragedy is not exclusively a theatrical experience, but rather a generic mode for making grief, suffering, and destructive intelligible. This is actually controversial. So my chief opponent, as it were, is Hans Thiers Lehmann. According to Hans Thiers Lehmann, in his book, Tragedy and Post-Dramatic Theatre, the tragic must be thought of as a mode of aesthetic articulation and not as a lived reality, a phenomenon strictly tied to the theatre. And Lehmann in his book also wants to exclude a whole number of other areas of life as not tragic. So he wants to exclude cinema to individualizing, literature to reductive, philosophy to rigid, and even the wrong kind of dramatic theatre from his account, as well as everyday tragedies. All of these are said by him variously to reduce tragedy. But his strict attempt at what he describes admiringly as crystal clear determination seems to me a desperate defense against a far more interesting nebulous conundrum of our times, namely that we encounter the world through spectacle and media reports. We immediately turn an event into narrative, and we form communities of response, whether of pity or fear or shock or anger, or even the half acknowledged guilt of indifference. And I'm interested in indifference as well. Surely the relationship between event and experience and idea, referred to fleetingly and enigmatically by Raymond Williams at the beginning of his book, Modern Tragedy, which gives rise to and is tested by tragedy, both on the stage and off or beyond. Surely this speaks more urgently to our times, to our position both as literary critics and as concerned citizens. Rather than continue to demarcate literary or aesthetic tragedy from, as Lehmann will put it, the glib way in which the word is used in the vernacular, as so many critics do, it seems right to take the vernacular seriously, to think about what it might mean to analyze tragedies in the world with as much serious critical attention as we have devoted so many times before to the tragic canon. Tragedy offers us a tradition, a mode of thinking, a genre for seeking to make intelligible, as I said, events, political decisions, wars, revolutions, gains and losses, man-made disaster and environmental destruction, the material interconnected circumstances of the last 2 decades we have lived through, attending both to our implication and participation in these affairs, and also to our detachment, our problematic capacity to aestheticize or to shape and modify difficult experience. So, how can we read events and history as tragedy? This is a necessarily very brief sort of sketch in today's lecture, but I'm going to point to 3 aspects or concerns of traditional tragedy, which offer a mode of thinking about our participation in or witnessing of contemporary affairs. And these are terms taken from Aristotle's Poetics. So what I would call narrative plots, Aristotle refers to as mythos, recognition, anagnorisis, or what I've called responsibility or choice, Aristotle's hamartia. So first of all, mythos, plot. As you all know, Aristotle famously pointed to the importance of the tragic plot. Every tragedy should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Well-constructed plots should not end in random. So to go back to 9/11, many people have written about the unnamability of the event. We do not know what it is, and so do not know how to describe, identify, or even name it, Derrida has said. Alex Howen, in his very good book, Terrorism, Modern Literature, talks about its excess and or hyperbole. And Christian Versluis has written about the way it defeats the normal process of meaning making and semiosis. But tragic narratives that reordered the world in Tony Blair's terms were formulated that attempted to name the unnameable of 9/11, combining memory, commemoration, narrative, and feeling to powerful effects. So besides the acts of lament that I described at the beginning, the portraits of grief and so on, there were, to put it schematically, 2 different narratives that reordered the confused responses to the attacks in the months and years following 9/11. These were symbolized for me by the 2 contrasting ceremonies that I attended in New York in 2004. So in the morning of September the 11th, 2004, the official ceremony took place at the site of Ground Zero, where once the 2 great towers of the World Trade Center had soared. By 2004, the site was completely cleared of rubble, but not yet rebuilt upon. It was a huge pit ringed by a high wire mesh fence around which we stood respectfully, peering through at the city dignitaries and the families of the victims gathered below us. Mayor Bloomberg spoke over the loudspeaker system. A minute's silence was observed by the whole vast arena to mark the moment the first plane hit the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. George Pataki and Giuliani, the former mayor, said some words. Another minute of silence to mark the moment the second plane hit. A lone trumpet struck up the last post, and then the voices of bereaved parents and grandparents began to read out the names of the dead in alphabetical order, the sound echoing against the empty shells of buildings behind us and the vacant New York bedrock at our center. Later that evening in 2004, I made my way down to the Hudson River for the alternative 9/11 ceremony, gathering at a pier on the west side of the city and looking across at the beam of light shooting into the sky where the World Trade Center once loomed. The informal group lit paper lanterns in the traditional Japanese fashion and set them on the water to float away down the river in the sunset and out to the open water. Different family members of those who had died in the September the 11th attack made speeches and offered prayers. I want to remember all those who died on 9/11, said the brother of one woman who had died 3 years earlier. But I also want to remember all those who have died since in the name of 9/11. This was 2004. The Taliban had been toppled and much of Afghanistan flattened. Saddam Hussein had been captured. Civil war in Iraq and the so-called insurgency was beginning. And a parallel was being drawn daringly by this speaker between the Hudson, beside the Hudson, between us in New York and them in Afghanistan and Iraq. These two ceremonies to remember the dead were both acts of tragic narrative. The words, the ritual, the ceremony stood in place of the actual bodies or lives of those commemorated on this day, managing loss by narrating it, as Rowan Williams puts it in his recent book, The Tragic Imagination. Yet, in other respects, these two events were in marked contrast. The first, at Ground Zero, focused on the American lives lost 3 years earlier, together with a collective resolve to fight for the perceived American values of freedom and democracy. The crowd turned inward to the empty bedrock at our midst. The second ceremony looked outward and was prepared to acknowledge that the events of September the 11th, 2001, had not ended neatly on that date. No neat Aristotelian tragic narrative could be imposed upon the experience. The tragedy of the post-9/11 world is located in the choice between these two narratives. The first response was to turn the understandable grief and anger into violent revenge. And the other response by the Hudson was to break that revenge genre, to think about our vulnerability and that of others, to learn a radical and risky compassion. But of course, this second alternative use of grief was the choice not taken. Instead, we opted for revenge tragedy, a classic genre and one of the oldest, bloodiest and morally murkiest in the Western canon. Revenge tragedy teases with the promise of moral clarity and aesthetic symmetry, only to exceed those desires and expectations. And think Aristotle, Aeschylus's Oresteia, which we can discuss later. So that's very briefly plot. So now my second example, recognition, anagnorisis. The act of recognition brings aspects of theatre performance and forms of attention together with contemporary political theory. It marks the moment when aesthetics turns to ethics and vice versa, thus bridging this schism between different notions of tragedy. According to Aristotle, tragic drama functions by appealing to the pity and fear of the audience. These emotions lead us to identify with the experience of the other person and therefore to develop a form of empathy. The divisions between individuals break down in this experience of mutual recognition and compassion. Tragedy works in this sense like a dramatized form of Levinasian ethics. We're shaken out of our complacency by our responsibility to the other. This happens startlingly in Aeschylus's play, the Persians. I've got a picture of the National Theatre of Greece's production of the Persians on the slide here. So in Aeschylus's play, The Persians, in which the audience is called upon to feel pity for Xerxes, the king of the Persians, who was responsible for the invasion of Greece just 8 years earlier. But pity and fear can operate very differently by shoring up boundaries and furthering division. Aristotle saw the polarization of tragic response into pity and fear as a fundamental consequence of the act of recognition, arguing that recognition is a change from ignorance to knowledge, bringing characters into either a close bond or enmity with one another. While the fear can be based upon a recognition of common human fallibility, a man like ourselves, it can also produce hostility and terror. In that case, the act of recognition might be said to make the world intelligible by stratifying it, leading to injustice and patterns of subordination and dominance, as Pacham Markel has argued in his book, Bound by Recognition. And Aeschylus's Persians also appeals potentially to this stratifying form of fear by dramatizing Xerxes's grief as an excessive foreign spectacle. So tragedy, and the same tragedy, Persians, in other words, appeals to both our best and our worst nature. It plays a vital moral function in expanding our civic compassion and tolerance and humility, but it's also a vehicle for intolerance, cruelty, and vengeance. The almost 20-year-long war on terror, ranging across different theatres and targets from Afghanistan and Iraq to Pakistan, Yemen, Syria, and Somalia, raises most acutely the possibilities and problems of recognition. On the one hand, the public has a fuller, more vivid and more numerous picture of the enemy now than ever before. We are, as it's often said, flooded with images from around the world. There's an instantaneous 24/7 news transmission. We expect to see images of terrorists and hear details of attacks and campaigns within minutes of their occurrence. Visual recognition of the enemy by the military is more intimate too. Drone pilots operating in their base outside Las Vegas watch the daily habits of individual targets 12,000 miles away and pick off figures on their weekly kill list, monitoring any deviation from the ordinary routine. The drone policy is changing slightly in that Obama centralized it, Trump decentralized it, and Biden, as I understand it, is reviewing the policy, but there's still drone attacks going on. Yet, on the other hand, these examples of forms of intimate attention exercised both by the news-watching public and by the drone pilots in their bunker also disclose acts of non-recognition. To adapt Donald Rumsfeld, we see what we see, and sometimes we see what we don't see, but is it the case that often we don't see what we don't see? The famous picture of the killing of Osama bin Laden focuses not on the figure of the enemy, but on the faces of the White House team in the Situation Room, anxiously watching the TV monitor, relaying the progress of the Navy SEALs. The significance of this picture was intensified for me when it was evoked in the 2012 National Theatre production of Antigone, directed by Polly Findlay. Then Creon and other Thebans gathered around a TV monitor to watch the fatal battle between Eteocles and Polynices. Antigone turns around the question of how we treat our enemies, about the recognizability, or what Judith Butler might term the grievability, of Polynices and other enemies of the state. Both the White House and Creon refuse to look at or allow others to look at the dead bodies of their foes. That decision prevents the enemy from becoming a spectacle or a martyr. Think, for example, of the difference between the treatment of bin Laden and the treatment of Saddam Hussein. But it also results in a failure of self-recognition that such an act of witnessing might induce. As a coda to the White House picture, the Pentagon released footage found in bin Laden's compound after he was killed of the leader watching himself and Obama on TV, flicking from channel to channel via a remote control. These two images, the Situation Room photo and the compound home movie, testify to a double failure or refusal to see, covered by an obsession with viewing. In the first, the ambivalent possibilities of depicting the spectators of a hidden picture aim to cultivate the notion of the enemy as opaque, fearful, but also as insignificant. The spectating group are formed and conformed by what they see and recognize and fear or hate. Our attention is carefully composed to be about them, not about what they are watching. In the second haphazardly shot image, the spectator bin Laden is also formed by what he sees, the narcissism of watching oneself on television, not lost on the video's many commentators. The film was released, presumably to make him an object of ridicule. But the gap between the visible television image and the unseen viewer actually demands what the Pentagon never envisaged, a sense of the pathetic, or dare we say, of pity. All we see is bin Laden's hand clutching the television remote control, flicking from one channel to the next, although all seem to offer the same visual library. Choice, but no choice, a hand which seeks through the touch of a button, a visual recognition of polarized enmity. Such is the tragic spectral image which haunts the Situation Room, the iconic representation of the war. One image, it seems to me, calls up the other, invoking the hidden blind spots that are paradoxically foundational for the politically useful force of fear. In viewing these two images, we are forced to face questions that are central to tragedy about our sense of ourselves as a society, what we choose to recognize and what we do not. And so my third example of tragic witness or aspects of tragedy as a way of reading the events in the world is hamartia. Tragic plots revolve around the moment when the hero makes the wrong choice, or what Aristotle calls the hamartia. Macbeth kills the king. Theseus curses his son in Euripides' play Hippolytus. There is then a very limited period of time between deed and consequences. As soon as Macbeth kills the king, he is damned. His drunken porter turns the castle into hell, and unnatural signs of turmoil, horses eating each other, follow that very same night. But what about the tragedy of environmental disaster which is facing us? It operates according to a different timescale. The bleaching of the coral reefs, the shrinking of the Arctic polar ice, the extreme droughts and floods we are experiencing worldwide with increasing frequency are symptoms and portents of decisions already taken whose full consequences have not yet been felt. So to put it simply, there's a time lag between carbon emission and temperature rise. The 1 degree rise above global average that we are now experiencing is due to carbon emissions released around 40 years ago, while the amount of carbon in the atmosphere now is enough to force 2 degrees of warming by the mid-century. And if we continue at the current rate of emitting around 2 parts per million more of carbon each year, we will have reached 471 parts per million by 2050, which translates as about 3 degrees of temperature rise some decades later. This relentless linear plot is complicated by the terrifying twists known as the climate change feedback loops. So once you've warmed beyond 2 degrees, the carbon feedback loop kicks in, where plants no longer absorb carbon dioxide, they start to sort of puff it out instead. And then between 3 and 4 degrees of warming, the Arctic tundra thaws and it starts to emit methane, which amplifies the temperature rise still further. And this is what is known as runaway climate change, when the consequences of global warming become the causes of further warming. The planet becomes its own dirty polluter, and the linear progression of cause and effect is inverted, speeded up, and stretched beyond the capacity of exact prediction. This is all to say that the tragic plot of climate change is much more elongated than tragic plots in the theatre, stretching the connection of cause and consequence to 40 years between transgression and punishment. But hamartia still produces consequences. Fate is just as inexorable, and the logic just as implacable. It's like Prometheus nailed to his rock in the Caucasus in Aeschylus's famous play, knowing that centuries in the future his defiance will ensure the toppling of Zeus. At first, that play appears to be about an unchanging situation, the implacable opposition between Prometheus, who stole fire from the gods to give to man, and Zeus, chief of the immortals, who has chained his opponent to a rock in retaliation. Yet the conflict between Zeus and Prometheus is not static, nor is it fated to last forever. Prometheus can foresee changes decades, centuries, and millennia ahead. He knows the secret cause of Zeus's overthrow in the future from prophetic signs he can detect now, but he's reluctant to divulge it. And so the implacable fate of Zeus and Prometheus turns out to be based on Prometheus's will and upon the brinkmanship between the two. In the superhuman world of Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, decisions taken now will have repercussions which continue to be felt centuries down the line. The Greeks believed that each generation of the gods usurped the previous ones, with the result that the world was not stable but subject to change, conquest, and destruction. Of course, the generations of gods lasted longer than the generations of men. The Olympian gods seemed pretty powerful and impregnable, but eventually the Greeks believed they too would go. For the Greeks, it was a question of distinguishing between two types of time, chronos and kairos. Chronos was the long-term passage of time, the 3,000 years of sleep unsheltered hours as the crawling glaciers pierced with the spears of their moon-freezing crystals, according to Shelley's Prometheus Unbound. Kairos, on the other hand, was the timely moment, the point of crisis, the event, rather than the trend. Those climate change deniers who deliberately confuse weather events, a sudden cold spell, with long-term climate change, a steady rise in global temperature year on year, would do well to think about the difference between chronos and kairos. The philosopher Stephen Gardner wrote in 2011 that our lack of action to tackle climate change is dependent upon a perfect storm, as he put it, of ethical blind spots. We can't see the direct connection between the past, the present, and the future, or between individual behavior and global consequence. It's not our problem, we tell ourselves. It's for hypothetical generations in the future to worry about, or else it's so huge that whatever we do will make little difference. But if we view climate change not only as a scientific or even a philosophical challenge, but also as a tragic narrative that can be read and interpreted like an Aeschylean or Shakespearean play, then we might think about time, fate, and individual responsibility differently. But what difference does it make to read the climate crisis as a tragedy? Just because we might think differently about fate and individual responsibility, as I've just said, will that mean that we alter our behavior? This is a question that is posed century after century in tragic dramas themselves. Pathai mathos, we learn through suffering, the chorus sing, more in hope than expectation in Aeschylus's Oresteia. Tragedies might seem to have the purpose of teaching us something, pathai mathos, but what that thing is and how they do it is far from clear. It might even be that they teach us paradoxically that some things cannot be taught, that there is nothing to be learned. Does it help us to know that temperature rise is inevitable, given the fact that the carbon has already been emitted into the atmosphere? But Prometheus is adamant that knowledge is power. Nailed to his rock and visited by other characters, he is determined to show them their future too, even if the revelation in the short term causes them pain and anxiety. Getting a more long-term perspective on the world and telling stories so that the past, present, and future become connected in a continuous trajectory allows him to gain some form of control over events. It's long been thought that there is a connection between narrative and moral order. Retelling events in the form of tragic narrative, therefore, is to attempt to recalibrate the world, to understand the choices and errors made along the way, and to set it back in balance. In relation to climate change, this might mean realizing that interventions are necessary, that we will need not only to curb or cease emissions, but also to actively suck carbon out of the atmosphere if we want to avoid the inevitable temperature rise above 2 degrees. And Bill Gates was just talking about that last week. In more abstract terms, it also means altering our perspective on the environment and our future to realize our individual and collective responsibility, our hamartia, and to understand the importance of our attitudinal perspectives to bring about change. There can be no action unless there is a collective change of attitude. One effect of environmental catastrophe is that it kills off the possibilities of theoretical thinking altogether. As Bill McKidman has said, we've reached the end of nature. There's no natural world, no untouched wilderness beyond human influence or control. It's to register this sense that the globe has been transformed by human activity that atmospheric scientists have coined a word for the new geological epoch in which we now find ourselves, the Anthropocene. Philosophical thought becomes difficult in this environment, partly because of the lack of any external referent or measure. As philosophers might say, the objective has become subjective. There is nothing outside the text of human narrative. But also, theoretical thinking is difficult for the much more practical reason that human civilization as we know it is threatened. For the irony is that while nature is irrevocably shaped by human activity, the natural consequences in the form of sea level rise, storm or drought will overwhelm us beyond anything we can control. We have reached the end of nature, but nature will end us. The Anthropocene term has come to signify not only the impact of humans upon the earth, but also the extinction of civilization. How can we think ourselves out of life? According to writer and former soldier Roy Scranton, in a 2013 New York Times article, the solution is to learn how to die in the Anthropocene. With the time lag of carbon emissions and temperature rise, the failure of current governments and wider publics to do anything to change our current energy use, and the prospect of runaway climate change, we're already living a doomed existence. What we have to do in this situation, like a samurai warrior going into battle, is to meditate upon our death. We can learn to see each day as the death of what came before, freeing ourselves to deal with whatever problems the present offers without attachment or fear, argues Scranton. The effect is to treat existence as a tragedy to which we are stoically resigned, or even to detach oneself from the world like a Buddhist monk, transcending the particular through meditation and eventual enlightenment. And in this case, Western models of tragedy become a less useful tool for thinking than the Eastern model of detachment as an ideal to be welcomed. But it seems to me there exists an alternative model to think with, Aeschylus's extenuated tragic plot in Prometheus Bound. Aeschylus, like the samurai warrior, doesn't shy away from confronting the weakening power of human agency in the face of the vast inhuman forces of time, place, and destiny. But still, he stresses that fate depends on individual choices and that each of us must continue to act and accept culpability. He leaves room for contingency, for resistance and responsibility. Progress is dependent upon each character's knowledge and acknowledgement. We're not free to detach ourselves, but remain vitally attached through tragic witness to attend to those signs of the past, present, and future, and to our capacities for action. And so, to conclude, genre and generic intelligibility. So the experiences that I've been discussing so far are in many ways kind of unthinkable, unrepresentable, incomprehensible. 9/11, the war on terror, climate change. They're hard to fathom, partly because they're so recent. They've hardly had time to settle from event into narrative, from experience into knowledge. But they also have the shattering effect of removing individuals from the picture. They might not seem to be understandable on a human scale. These crises, we might say, disfigure our imaginations. They remove the individual that makes empathy possible, or they turn it into a spectacle. Yet, through the critical 2 decades that I've been discussing, figures are put back by the popular imagination into the void, through the act of mourning and lament after 9/11, through the plots and patterns exposed by the symmetries of revenge and the Iraq War. We project the human scale with all its particularities and feelings back into the inhuman disaster. We can even endeavour to shape the unthinkable catastrophe of global warming through Aeschylus's play Prometheus Bound, with its standoff between the Titan and the tyrannical god. Thinking about our contemporary world involves a tussle between figural interpretation and disfiguration. Individual fortunes and feelings are negated in the chaotic roller coaster of history, only for them to return repeatedly in our news stories and private experiences as prompts for grief or anger or fear. According to the great critic Erich Auerbach, figural interpretation establishes a connection between 2 events or persons, the first of which signifies not only itself, but also the second, while the second encompasses or fulfills the first. And Auerbach is primarily thinking about the Old and New Testaments here, the New Testament as a transformation and fulfillment of the Old. But we could equally well suggest that tragedy is another such figurative and figuring way of seeing, both in the sense of reminding us of the figure in history with his or her own feelings and desires, and also in the Auerbach sense of reading one historical event in light of another. Thus, history, with all its concrete force, remains forever a figure, cloakful and needful of interpretation, continues Auerbach. If tragic events are open to being read in the light of previous events, or indeed in the light of a long canonical tradition of tragic drama and philosophy, this is because there is something generic about human suffering and error and anger and cruelty. And there's been a tendency amongst critics to push back against the notion of the genre and to describe the transformation of an experience or description into something generic as being something regrettable and problematic. Generic empties out politics and makes sorrow bland. But I'm wanting to find value in the generic. I want to recuperate the genre of tragedy as a powerful hermeneutic tool. So setting individual stories into a wider traditional pattern of narrative or theatre has the merit of making intelligible what seems particular. It makes it recognizable and therefore grievable. It allows us to read the world out of joint. This is not to say that such figural tragic interpretation smooths out the difficulties or empties out the content. Traditionally, tragic drama makes us see each text and each performance as unique to that place, that moment, that body. And that is frequently the unexpected and devastating punctum, as Roland Barthes puts it, in any performance. But tragedies also figure that moment of witness in a wider context too. They make it readable within a tradition. Of course, as I hope I've made clear, despite Aristotle's analysis in the Poetics, tragic dramas are not strictly and successfully patterned. They don't offer the God's eye view. Classical tragedy acknowledges its own blind spots and resistances, and frequently doesn't conform to or confine itself within the pattern. It registers unruliness. So reading events now, figuring them again in the tradition of tragedy, is by no means to order them, and it's certainly not to come up with a solution or a recipe for organizing the world in a better way. But it is to pay attention to the wider narratives of our times and to think about the attempts to make week-to-week events intelligible through that patterning. We can then try to think seriously about the relationship between history, politics, and culture, and the historically contingent nature of the stories we tell about our world and the rituals we employ to make it bearable or even register our lack of understanding. And this might be the start of action, informing and revising the structures of feelings and the ideas of tragedy that respond to social disorder, and recuperating a sense of what we all share, what we hold generically in common. Might we then collectively and gradually hope to bend that flawed and fragile arc of the moral universe steadfastly towards justice?